Welcome to Mass Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. Let me first start with my macro thoughts from the 29th of September 2014, a small window for sharks as dollar rises. Increasingly, the market is of the view that they will raise rates in December. My only concern about that is December is typically a thin period in the financial markets, and a rate hike after nearly a decade of no move is going to be a pretty dramatic development which might get amplified in a thin market environment. Home thoughts: the Eiffel Tower is once again open and lit, this time in blue, white and red. Many years ago I went to a fabulous restaurant halfway up the Eiffel Tower called the Jules, Verne. Had a fantastic meal there. Political reflections: for the first time in 20 years, UN chief is to visit North Korea. That's a pretty big step. ISIS in a video threatened Washington. We swear that we will strike America at its center. The alleged Paris mastermind is the Belgian-born Abdelhamid Abouad, apparently, according to AP. I'll put up a photograph of him. And on social media, he is referred to by his nom de guerre, Abu Umar al-Belghiki. I spoke about this at the time of the Boston bombers. And, when you think about it, there's 7 billion of us, and therefore, folks like this, and I think one of the most interesting literary books to look at is something like L'Étranger by Albert Camus, which talks about this chap in Algeria who loses his bearings and kills a man, and practically feels nothing about it. And in 7 billion people, the fat tail of people who are like Abdelhamid Abouad and others is quite a big number. The Lycée, the president met with members of parliament. He's obviously putting in a state of emergency for 3 months. And I touched on this at the end of my article over the weekend: terrorism's impact on the global economy. And the point I was making is that if this is the new normal, then we're in a very, very dramatic new phase of this whole thing. And Bloomberg put out an interesting report. The global economic cost of terrorism is now at its highest since 9/11. In the wake of Friday's massacre in Paris, a new report says the world is paying the highest price for terrorism since the 2001 attack on the Twin Towers. In 2014, acts of terror cost the world $52.9 billion, roughly the size of Bulgaria's entire annual GDP. And I'll put up a few graphs. Look at this, the geography of terrorism, and you can see Sub-Saharan Africa, for the size of its economy, is taking a huge chunk in that geography. Francois Hollande called IS the biggest terrorist factory the world has ever known. He's not wrong. And then I go back to the article I wrote: weapons of mass communication, as Virilio calls them, creating a panic-driven tele-reality. City of panic, of course. Virilio maintains that the global village has created hyper-terrorism as its integral accident, just as derailment is the integral accident of a train. Nations will have to defend themselves not abroad, but within their own dense metropolises. The metropolitics of globalization will take over the geopolitics of nations. That's an interesting point. I'm reading his book, The Information Bomb. I put up a photograph of it, and it's very good. Now, obviously, there was a rapprochement between POTUS and President Putin. Have a look at this photograph. I said on the 5th of October that Putin is a geopolitical grandmaster, and he might be getting crushed in oil warfare still, with the oil price going lower, but he's managed to reinsert himself, and how, in the geopolitical chessboard. Abdullah Bozkurt reports remarks made by President Putin from a G20 sideline event. Putin: I provided examples based on our data on the financing of different ISIL units by private individuals. This money, as we have established, comes from 40 countries and there are some of the G20 members among them. I've shown our colleagues photos taken from space and from aircraft which clearly demonstrate the scale of the illegal trade in oil. Putin provided that information in the photos yesterday. Obama must have been deeply embarrassed. Suddenly, a day after Putin exposed the US reluctance to hit IS where it is needed, a big truck assembly was bombed. Intensifying pressure on the Islamic State, United States warplanes for the first time attacked hundreds of trucks on Monday that the extremist group has been using to smuggle the crude oil it has been producing in Syria, American officials said. It seems that Putin's naming and shaming with regards to the oil smuggling was successful. And then have a look at this photograph of President Obama appearing to share a joke with Mr. Putin in sign of relations with Moscow thawing. So, we've had a big game changer in that regard, haven't we? And it's interesting how it worked, because Putin has been signaling this from the time he went in the UN General Assembly. But his point about financing is the correct one, and until, and some of the financiers, of course, allies of the West, and that puts the West in this very difficult position where this threat, which is being financed by our allies, is now becoming a threat to you. And that was the point I was making about, it reverberating back. Currency markets, the euro 106.51, big drop. Dollar index 99.58, Japanese yen 123.27, Swissy 1.0112, pound 151.71, Aussie 0.7084, India rupee 65.935, South Korean won 11.6949, Rial 382.65, Egyptian pound 783, South African rand 14.3585. Dollar index, let me put up a 3-month chart. It clearly is tilted higher. The market's expectation now for the rate hike is sky high. Euro dollar, let me put up a 3-month chart back towards looking at parity, 106.52. I think the low from earlier this year was something like 104.86. So that's what we've got to keep an eye on. Commodity markets, gold now trading at 1080, triple digits. Here we come. Crude oil, $42.69. 30 handle, looks like it's on its way. Interesting this, all commodities ran up from 2000 to 2008, and they were basically back down again. Then they are basically back down again where they started 15 years ago, with the exception of cocoa. Cocoa is up 16% in 2015, and it's among the 24 raw materials tracked by the Bloomberg Goldman Index. Nothing has done better than cocoa this year, so there you go. Chocolate. Shanghai copper is down 4.6%, hitting fresh cycle lows not seen since March 2009. Shanghai, obviously. I couldn't resist this. Arion and partner Airbus intend to build a civilian plane capable of transonic travel, a niche left vacant since the retirement of the Concorde in 2003. Let's move on to Africa. US Embassy in Madrid tweeted, El Jefe del Comando para Africa, US Africa Command, visita al ministro. And I concluded that the US has a hard power lead in Africa. 17 young Angolan activists were charged in court with rebellion against the state on Monday. Young campaigners were detained in June after organizing a reading of the US academic Gene Sharp's 1993 book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, a conceptual framework for liberation. The book's blurb describes it as a blueprint for non-violent resistance to repressive regimes. And I think the regime is overacting, big time. Have a look at this photograph that RFI tweeted of Luanda. On the 10th of August, I said, well, the end is nigh for crude oil and oil producers from Caracas to Luanda, from Riyadh to Abuja. And we put up a photograph of President Jose Eduardo dos Santos at the presidential palace. 21st of September, I said, in Angola, President Eduardo dos Santos is leveraging the balance sheet, drawing down loans to make up the shortfall and stamping down hard on any whisper of dissent. and this is a whisper, isn't it? 17 Angolan activists on trial for organising a book reading. And I think that is the irony of it all. Fed suspense grips African central banks and final policy move. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market about what will happen if the Fed eventually decides to hike rates. Some may be forced to hike rates further. No one knows how much more exchange rates can weaken. I think we're nearing the bottom in many cases now. Swiss commodity traders bought about $55 billion worth of crude oil from African national oil companies from 2011 to 2013, a quarter of the volume sold by the governments. Investors are starting to consider South Africa as risky as junk-rated Russia. 5-year credit default swaps on South African debt have risen 84 basis points this year to 275. Russia has dropped 188 basis points to 287. South Africa's debt as a percentage of GDP will be more than twice that of Russia and remain so through 2020. The problem with South Africa is there aren't any bright spots. Always seems within reach. Fiscal consolidation always seems within reach, and then just as you try to get there, it jumps another couple of years into the future. Couldn't resist this photograph that the Sunday Times tweeted of President Zuma, and they said, unrepentant. South African all-share, which by the way is down 2,246 points in November, is up 3.57% year-to-date, which isn't a bad performance, but then you've got to take off the currency. Dollar rand, let me put up a 3-month chart. That looks like it's going to 15. Egyptian pound, 783.01. 15, yes. Dollar rand. Egyptian EGX 30 has fallen to a 23-month low, and it's down 27.4% this year. Nigerian all-share down 17.67% year-to-date. Ghana surprised the markets by lifting rates to 26%. Ghana Stock Exchange Composite Index down 13.17% this year. George Bodo, South Sudan's oil revenues slump. Have a look at how much they've slumped by. And, there was this theory that when you really get into a problem, you start to reform big time. But I think in Africa, it might well be the opposite, that you just end up in some kind of war to the death over a scarcer resource, which seemed to me what's happening in South Sudan. Here in Kenya, Williamson Tea reported first half profit after tax ramped 126.2% higher. Finance income was up 237% at 120 million. They've been long cash. Profit was up. Profit after tax up 126.53%. And basically their long cash position was responsible for a big surge in finance income. It's a cheap share now, earning half-year earnings per share 41.66, double that 82, and you're looking at a P of about 4. So it's a cheap share on a forward P basis and on a net asset value basis, because just for example, look at this total assets, 8.8 billion, market cap 3.1 billion. Captoria Tea, which is a sister company, reported profit after tax accelerated 110.45%. Earnings per share up 110.41%. Cheap share, very similar to Williamson Tea on a forward PE basis and on net asset value calculation. ARM rallied 9.09% yesterday, biggest gainer. And they're looking for 10.7 billion shillings in a private bond, looking to raise $105 million. Proceeds from the 5-year bond will be used to replace existing short-term borrowings. There is no increase in total debt, only refinancing existing short-term debt. So that's good news that they're upsizing it. Kenya shilling last trading at 102.245 is behaving quite well. Nairobi all share up 4.698% in November, but still down 11.76% year to date. NSE 20 up 2.579% since the 3rd of November, down 23.16% year to date. Equity Group reversed its interest rate hike yesterday in a pre-market opening briefing, talking about the T-bill rate. 91-day T-bills at 9.654%. So yes, the market's been recovering. It looks as if it can recover some more. It was, of course, badly oversold. Once again, thank you for stopping by.